Stephen Ireland was the founder and self-appointed safeguarding lead of Pride in Surrey, an LGBTQ group that had the local authorities and politicians in its grip. He even had a show on BBC Radio Surrey. Multiple women raised safeguarding concerns about his behaviour around young people, but they were dismissed and vilified by those in power. Lo and behold, in 2025, Ireland was sentenced to 24 years for raping a 12-year-old boy and for multiple other sexual offences against children. The story of how this atrocity has been allowed to happen has been ignored by the media. So today I'm joined by Julie Bindel, the lesbian feminist campaigner who has done her own independent coverage. Julie Bindel, thank you so much for joining us, despite the fact that you're still recovering from the flu. I'm really grateful to have you here because this is an extremely important issue and story that frankly has not had the coverage that it really needs to have, and it's been left to journalists, excellent journalists such as yourself, to cover it on your own independent platform when really this should be national news, in my opinion. Would you mind explaining who Stephen Ireland is, first of all, to our viewers?
Yes, and thank you so much, Connie, for showing an interest. Stephen Ireland was the self-appointed head of Pride in Surrey, which is, as you'll know, a county in England that he was operating from with some cohorts, deciding, he said, to bring together the LGBTQIA plus community in celebration of diversity. And he operated in plain sight, despite there being various red flags, with other men that he was, as it eventually came out in court, having large chemsex orgies with, whilst targeting young, vulnerable boys and getting away with it. So the scandal is that the man that was lauded as setting up a big organisation for the good of the community, where he was lauded by police, social services, foster care agencies, Surrey County Council, and others, ended up, of course, being exposed as a child abuser.
Mm-hmm. And he had connections with the BBC. Now, when the dossier came out, when the Telegraph exposed it, about the BBC bias when it came to trans issues in particular, I was on Stephen Nolan's paper review when Trump gave his interview to Bev Turner, actually on GB News, and we had a bit of a back and forth about whether the BBC had an issue. Stephen Nolan said that there was no issue with impartiality at the BBC, despite the fact that he'd done his own investigation into Stonewall and how it influences the BBC. What were Stephen Ireland's connections to the BBC, and subsequently, what was the way in which the BBC covered the fact that he had been convicted of raping a 12-year-old boy?
Good question. So he was, as I say, lauded within the county and promoted widely within the county. I mean, he was sitting in police cars that were adorned with the rainbow flag and being driven around in a celebratory fashion. And he also was a weekly guest on BBC Surrey, a particular programme, one of the LGBTQ programmes that was, well, the LGBTQ programme. It went on, where he was being photographed outside the BBC. Those photographs were then on his social media, where the connection was very, very clear that BBC loved him. Now, when I went to the sentencing, which was in June of 2025, I was one of two journalists on the press bench, the other being from one of the PA, agencies. There was no sign of the BBC. And when I checked why there was no coverage from them, bearing in mind what a big name he was with the local BBC, I was told that their reporter was elsewhere covering the inquest findings of a drag queen who had overdosed. And so I couldn't quite work out what the breaking news was on that story, as tragic as these cases are. And then when it came to the day, 2 days after the sentencing, where he was given a huge stretch, 30 years in total, for the rape of a 12-year-old boy and for various other related sexual offences, all of which were heinous, I listened, the whole podcast team tuned in to the BBC Surrey queer programme, and found no mention of it. No mention whatsoever. Not a word. It was clearly a Jimmy Savile type side eye, but to not mention it, I mean, that's pathetic.
You mentioned Jimmy Savile, and I thought when I was listening to your investigation on the podcast that one of the things that Stephen Ireland did was music covers, and how he did a cover of Creep. And that he released that after he'd been arrested. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. I mean, he almost was. He wasn't hiding in plain sight, let's be honest, nor was Savile. He was operating in plain sight. But let's look at the parallels. Jimmy Savile hid behind his charitable work. He hid behind doing work for example, hospitals, where he had the keys to a morgue where he was sexually defiling corpses. And this was but one of his MO. And these charities that he hid behind were those that nobody could look at and think were not worthy. For example, disabled children. Okay. Now, what Stephen Ireland was doing was he was hiding behind the rainbow flag. And thanks in part to transgender ideology, but also the whole queer ideology in total, he was able to do this whole thing of protect trans kids, protect queer kids. Now, I grew up in the 1970s, a young lesbian, and there was no such thing when I became an activist for equality and liberation of lesbians and gay men. There was no such phrase as queer or gay or lesbian children. You never ascribe a sexuality to a child. I mean, that's just straightforward. It's not just decency, it's child protection issues. And we used to say that adults that prescribed a sexuality to a child were straightforward, dodgy child abusers. But this ideology allowed Stephen Ireland to become one of the good guys, to be one of those that is, you've got to come through me if you're going to attack a trans child. There was a child in a photograph in a leather pop mask and gear who was being held by a leather lead, dog lead, by Stephen Ireland in a celebratory image that was then put on social media. He was telling us who he was, but because they have labelled anyone that dares to question these ideologies, he was protected.
And it's correct that Rebecca Paul, the MP, the current Conservative MP for Reigate, she reported that photo to the police and she didn't hear back.
That's right. So Rebecca Paul was a councillor at the time, and of course we have Lisa Townsend, the policing crime commissioner. Both women were whistleblowers. Both women tried to get some kind of traction when other whistleblowers were ignored. Rebecca Paul, as you say, didn't hear back when she reported that photograph, which was a clear safeguarding red flag. And in fact, it went further than that. It went further than these two women. And there were others. As we interview in the podcast, we explain who these other whistleblowers were, that tried to get the council to look at the fact that Stephen Ireland had appointed himself safeguarding lead and therefore would be responsible for investigating himself if there were any questions about the safety of children. He appointed himself as the lone volunteer on a scheme for queer kids to call up and get counselling or advice over the phone of which was then destroyed and has never been found once the police investigation came. So there were all kinds of things that could have been discovered at the time that Rebecca Paul and Lisa Townsend made their concerns known. But as I say, it went further than that because these women were monstered, were vilified, were hounded, were harassed, were protested outside conferences, in the case of Lisa Townsend, where she spoke at the LGB Alliance conference, referred to as transphobes, homophobes, that accused of spouting hate speech, of being hateful, of being bigots.
Mm-hmm. I think a general concern, Julie, that a lot of sort of ordinary people who may not have any connection to any LGBT activism themselves. Obviously, now there is this split between LGB and the TQ for many people. But for people who have nothing to do with anything LGB or LGBT related, I think that from an outside perspective, people see Pride, the huge parades that go on in London and many cities across the country, and it's very noticeable that Pride, like you have said many times, is not what it used to be, and it seems to have attracted what you and I would describe as fetishists.
Yes.
These are people, in my opinion, the people that you see who are dressed up as furry animals, and I think there's a misunderstanding about what this is. First of all, why are they there in the first place? What is dressing up as a furry animal got to do with being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans? But why is it that, firstly, if you could explain, if you know anything about how that is linked to fetishes, and why is it that the modern trans ideology has encouraged this fetishization into what is now still described as Pride? How is it that in general these groups allow this breakdown of what Pride used to be and what being gay or even trans used to mean, when people used to just describe themselves as transsexual? Why is it that these groups have attracted basically men who now feel that they're able to parade their fetishes around?
Well, the problem started with queer theory in the 1990s, where lesbian and gay became all one word, and then queer was attached, and queer then became a descriptor for anyone who wasn't what they would say heteronormative, meaning heterosexual, that didn't have an interesting haircut and wasn't involved in a polyamorous relationship. So it was all up for grabs and became self-defining. So anything south of the B in the LGBTQ yada yada is basically a male kinkster, usually heterosexual. And actually we can look back before the 1990s to the 1970s, when the paedophile information exchange were welcomed by many gay men and some lesbians, but very few lesbians, into the so-called lesbian and gay rights movement as an oppressed sexual minority. And we know this scandal if we look up the National Centre for Civil Liberties, which at the time was run by various kind of fetishist, kinkster, trans-identified, basically just abusers, those that wanted to normalise the abuse of children, the activists, I mean, that were attached to the NCCL and to PI. They just saw it as one big liberation movement that would free all people who were not heteronormative, who weren't in married heterosexual couples, and who didn't have the sort of lifestyle that included washing their car on the street on a Sunday morning. So anyone a little bit different. The politics came completely detached from the lesbian and gay rights movement. It all became about a big party and a big celebration of so-called difference. And the same rules were not applied to those public displays of sexual kink that we would to heterosexuals. We would never accept, without a fight, men en masse in the street with their backsides hanging out of leather chaps, wearing no underwear and parading, their genitalia on the top of a float, resplendent with various drag queens and other kinksters. We would just go absolutely berserk. When it's done in the name of queer liberation, we're supposed to all just accept this is part of, and actually it's gay male sexuality in its rawest form, in its most unbridled form, where we just say it's a free-for-all, do as you like. So that's how it happened. And this isn't about anti-sex morality. This is not about a prudish desire to restrict people from having as much fun as they like. This is about public displays of kink, and it's about dragging children into displays of sexuality and describing them the same sexuality as adult men. That's effectively what we're looking at.
The research shows that if you have one fetish, you're likely to have multiple. Is that correct? More likely to?
Yes.
And so, do ordinary people have the right? Are they being reasonable, having concerns about these groups? Because I know of these groups in my local area. I know of people who have their children in these groups. What advice would you give to the parents of young children or young teenagers or adults who identify as queer or trans, who feel like this group is accepting to them? Because I feel like for many people, they're afraid, like as we've seen in this case, of raising any safeguarding concerns, because historically the idea that you would, because gay men were accused very unfairly a lot of the time of just being predators because they were gay, and I think that historical unfair accusation makes some people afraid now. But because we have this huge umbrella that's attracting these people who are happy to display their sexual kinks in public, so we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, what would you say to those parents who may have concerns about their own children or may have never come across stories like this?
You have to apply the same standard to the scenarios that you're concerned about, whether it involves gay or queer identified men or men of any other stripe, your regular bloke that works in a nursery or a sports team, and you think there's something dodgy. Trust your instincts. Do not put feeling uncomfortable or concern about being called homophobic or transphobic ahead of your concerns. If your concerns come only from the fact that you think, well, I've heard that Peter, who otherwise is a nice bloke and there's no other red flags, but I've heard he's a homosexual, so therefore he's bound to be abusing my children, that's prejudice. But if it's about looking at the red flags that are very prevalent in these cases, because they've been able to just be so open about their fetishes and call it queer pride, then you've got to act. Back in the day when the police were targeting gay men who were having sex in public places, in parks, in public toilets and the like, and they were doing the agent provocateur kind of sting, which is, they would go into one of the urinals, these undercover police officers, they would give hint or even a very clear sign, excuse me, or even a very clear sign that they were sexually attracted or wanted a sexual encounter with the man in the next urinal and then arrested them. That is prejudicial policing. That was rightly protested, although it's not good that anyone's having sex in public places at all, but that was challenged, as were the other prejudicial legal responses to homosexuality, such as the age of consent, which was unequal. It was 21 and then it was 18, then it was 16, which is right and good. But seriously, we can't say that because there have been unfair accusations in the past towards gay men, that they might pose the same danger to children as heterosexual men, like for like, is outrageous. Of course they do. And we recognise that a sizable minority of men pose a danger to women, to children, are sexual predators or sexual harassers. That's why we've got female-only space. The same rule applies when it goes to gay men and straight men. There used to be a mantra back in the old days of gay liberation. 99.9% of child abusers are heterosexual men. Well, that isn't true. It's not true. 99.9% of sexual abusers are men. You don't need the prefix. So, for God's sake, trust your instincts. This is not about singling out men because they're queer or gay or trans-identified. Having said that, yes, of course, treat those concerns equally, but really have a look if there are men out on Kinkster nights, dressed as furries, leading somebody around on a dog leash, openly displaying and celebrating their kink. They're more likely to be sexually disinhibited in a very unhealthy way when it comes to doing it around children. So maybe take an even closer look.
One question that I found myself asking, although perhaps it's quite obvious, but I think others may think it as well, is Stephen Ireland was particularly absolutely focused on trans ideology, and Maz Harding, one of the women who tried to stand up to him, who you interviewed on your podcast, explained that when she first went to a meeting, it was very clear that it was just for gay men and people who said that they were trans. If Stephen Ireland was able to have access to children anyway, why was he so keen on this trans women are women, self-ID is fine, any man can basically say he's a woman and he can go into women's bathrooms? Is it your view that trans ideology props all of this other stuff up? Because there are some people who are as dogmatic on the trans issue but would obviously not have the intention to abuse children. So how was it that why is it that there was such a focus on the trans issue, particularly other men who wanted to say that they were women? Because he was a gay man and targeted, it seems, although we may never know the full extent of it, he targeted young men who he didn't identify as trans himself. So why was there such a focus on the rights of trans women? Was he aiding his brothers who he maybe wanted to, give them the same access that he may have wanted himself?
Well, it's a good question, and Maz Harding is a really good example of someone who herself was, possibly still is, a trans activist. So she would say trans women are women. She stood firmly with Stephen Ireland and his cohorts in setting the tone about the inclusion of the T within the LGB, where, everybody now across the nation and beyond that is involved in any Pride events will know that the T dominates. As soon as these men attach themselves, that's it. It's a complete and utter takeover. So Maz Harding absolutely shared that that philosophy, if you like, that political belief. But she, as a woman, as a lesbian, who had seen the red flags, was not going to let that obscure what she was looking at. So if she can do that and be a trans activist, why not the others? Well, for Stephen Ireland and for these other men that are abusing, it's perfect, because as soon as you shout transphobe at somebody, you shut them up, and you therefore halt any robust scrutiny on the safeguarding front. Look at what happened to Lisa Townsend and Rebecca Paul. Look at what happened to anyone that tried to speak out about this just in this scenario, and we can look at a much wider field than that of women that have tried to point out that these men could be potentially a danger to children. They're just called transphobic. Their jobs are on the line, their reputations are ruined, their friendships are in tatters. So that's why, I think, that's one of the reasons why the likes of Stephen Ireland wholeheartedly embrace this. The other thing is vulnerability. If you've got young people saying, I'm trapped in the wrong body, I was born in the wrong body, I want to transition, I want to go on medication, I believe I'm the opposite sex, clearly there is a mental illness behind that. There is mental distress, there's trauma. I don't care what the trans activists say. You do not believe that you are the opposite sex unless there is something going on that is not healthy for you. And normally, usually, almost always, there is some kind of autistic spectrum, mental ill health, distress coming from trauma, often from sexual abuse or neglect in childhood. These are the perfect targets for these men. And so if these kids can say, I'm trans, feel like they're going to get attention, be looked after, be special, how much better than just being regular old, I think I'm attracted to the same sex, would that be?
On the topic of sort of the people who prop up people like Stephen Ireland, nearly all of, from what I can remember, nearly all of the people who did raise concerns were women. And often, if it wasn't another woman, and I want to come back to that, there were men who were defending him and suggesting that Lisa Townsend, the Police and Crime Commission, was in the wrong for raising questions, such as Gavin Stevens, who was the Chief of Police at the time, and the MP at the time, the Conservative MP at the time, Crispin Blunt. Why is it that men I always find it mind-boggling that men who aren't involved in these groups, who are in positions of authority, let alone involved in the police, for example, who understand male sexuality, they know that there are men out there who are creeps. You know, if they have children of their own, they understand the way that men think sometimes. I've heard other heterosexual men say it's crazy that other women or other people don't see this because we know as men, having hung out with other men, how some men's minds work. Why is it that other men who often don't have anything to do with the LGBT organisations defend men who do when there are clearly safeguarding concerns? And secondly, to ask two questions in one, why is it often women who also defend these men? What is it about women who are so quick to defend these men?
Well, the men like Crispin Hunt or whoever we want to talk about have nothing to lose, really. Their instinct is often to defend the male sex right. We've seen this through decades of my campaigning against sexual violence. I've seen it when it comes to sexual abuse of children by the clergy in group homes, in other institutions where they have just not bothered. Well, so what? Well, we don't really believe it. Well, often it's just exaggerated. So these are just scumbag men defending other scumbag men. And it's easier for them. They don't have to get caught in the crossfire. There's less at stake for them. And I think that just deals with those men. They often could not care less. Gavin Stevens, for example, who told Lisa Townsend that she had 3 years to make it up to Stephen Ireland and get back in his good books after she challenged him, rightly so, about some of his behaviour and actions and words. She was the one that had to capitulate. So it's straight up, straightforward, old-fashioned sexism. When it comes to the women, the ones that defend the likes of Stephen Ireland, and we saw this in the podcast with the Finn and Cooks, the two women, the married couple, lesbian couple, that defended him, that turned against Maz Harding when she whistleblew, that in fact banned her.
They gave her a cease and desist letter, didn't they?
That's right. They said that she would be arrested if she turned up to that year's Pride event. Called her homophobic and transphobic. I mean, this is a lesbian who was involved in Pride. So these women, often it's for their own expediency. They want to be liked, but they also want to get on. They want to have their own power base. They don't want to have the hassle that they've seen women like me have. They want to be in with the in crowd. There's more power around the likes of Stephen Ireland than with lesbians and feminists that are trying to challenge this terrible behaviour. And so it's cowardice, it's laziness, but it's something even worse than that. It's them themselves wanting to keep their noses clean to climb whichever ladder they're in the midst of climbing.
Mm-hmm. You went to Pride last year, which still went ahead despite the fact that its leader previously had been convicted of raping a 12-year-old boy. Can you describe to our viewers what happened when you went to Pride?
Our podcast team all got so-called VIP tickets, which is a hoot when you think about it. Some cordoned off section by the stage where if you paid a bit of money, you could get somewhere to sit down, listen to the terrible music. You got a goodie bag with rainbow-coloured whistles and Pride insignia, so that we could interview the likes of the local MPs, the mayor, any of the organisers that might be in there, and get easy access. We had gone through all of the different stalls, talking to a few people on the way, all of whom were very trans-inclusive, all of whom were this is one big happy queer family, including many heterosexuals that were out for the day, celebrating the diversity of their county. It was in Guildford this year. There have been many calls for it to be cancelled, at least out of respect for the 12-year-old rape victim who'd bravely gone forward and secured the conviction of Stephen Ireland and David Sutton, but also so that safeguarding checks and balances could be done before any Pride event could take part. The men at the helm, now that Stephen Ireland was in prison, were old cohorts of his, and I'm not saying that they were involved in any criminality, but they were friends with and former sexual partners of Stephen Ireland. So you have to have scrutiny and you have to have an independent review, which hasn't yet been published, although we're told it's going ahead. So there we were, talking to various individuals with our full recording equipment on display, introducing ourselves as journalists, telling them we were making a podcast series. Nothing was hidden. Did some interviews, and then lo and behold, after interviewing, oh God, what's her name? Zoe
Franklin.
That's it. And then after interviewing the MP for Guildford, who's very much pleased with herself for being at Pride, she had a rainbow painted face and looked very, very delighted with herself for being there. When she realised that we weren't just having a very nice interview saying, tell us about how wonderful it is being a queer ally, she turned on us, turned quite hostile, and went up to the organisers, pointed over at us, face like thunder. Lo and behold, a couple of minutes later, we were surrounded by private security who eventually carried out my producer and escorted me out when eventually I realised the game was up. We had to leave, or there would be even more trouble, which we could have done without, quite frankly. We wanted to get some more interviews. So a lesbian feminist was thrown out of Pride for asking questions about child safeguarding and about the risk to other children of sexual abuse. It was quite scandalous. It really beggars belief, and we have the audio of myself and Samantha, the producer, being told to leave. Also, our researcher, another producer on the podcast, Maria Esposito, who has been on the programme talking to Josh Howie, I think, about this, was told that she couldn't even come into Pride because she'd been filming Mr. Menno, who many of us know, who's a gay rights activist, who was holding a sign and chanting at the parade as it was going towards the venue, "Stop transing kids, stop transing away the gay." And because she'd been filming that and recording it for our podcast, she was told by the same security that were eventually to throw me and Samantha out that she was part of the protest and wasn't allowed in. So any dissenting voice, and we're talking about women here, were treated as though we were the enemy, whilst it was business as usual for the Pride Committee.
Mm-hmm. And to clarify, when you said that Stephen Ireland's comrades, so to speak, are still in charge, they're the Charlie Watts and Samuel Powell, who were partners of Stephen, as you said. There's no suggestion that they are involved or were involved with his crimes. They are now the safeguard leads of Surrey Pride. And Samuel Powell, in court at during Stephen Powell's case, was described as a pup fetishist who used crystal meth with Stephen Ireland and Watts. And Samuel Powell and Charlie Watts are now the safeguarding leads at Surrey Pride. I mean, how this can happen, and not only them still being in safeguarding lead, but Zoe Franklin, a Lib Dem MP, who doesn't know about the whole story. You mentioned the independent review. Rebecca Paul pointed out that it seemed as though there was a review that was done, but it was Stephen Ireland doing his own homework at one point. Would you be able to explain what reviews were done throughout this process, and then what's happening now with this case and what reviews we're waiting for?
There's been no review. Somebody might have looked at some evidence that was given to them and decided it amounted to nothing. There were some emails backwards and forwards between whistleblowers and the council that showed absolutely nothing had been done, but warm words and platitudes or just dismissals, rebukes. So actually nothing. But we are told that there is an ongoing investigation that will be done or is being done independently. And as soon as that is published, if it ever is, it will be on my Substack. And we will make sure that we distribute it publicly, because unless every T has been crossed and every I has been dotted and every single stone unturned, we will not be satisfied, because there is no doubt in my mind that there are countless other victims out there that have not come forward. And we need to make sure that we look at every single culpable person within the organisation, not just who were directly abusing children, but who were covering up and refusing to look at the evidence.
And Julie, where can people find your Substack?
If you look at my name and Substack, it will lead you to it. The podcast is free to listen to. Please leave comments. Tell me what you think about it. Give me a review. Tell me if you think there's any further investigation needs doing on this scandal. We can add new episodes. And please do share it as widely as you can.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Julie.
Thank you.
That was Julie Bindel, I'm Connie Shaw, and this is GB News Originals. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story as widely as possible. It has been ignored by those who should be shouting the loudest. Everyone must know not only of Stephen Ireland's crimes, but of the people who prevented others from trying to stop him.